Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I'm your General Body Member Coordinator.
Hi everyone, I'm Netanya. I'm your president for the school year. And we are the Asian Pacific American Medical Student Association of the Rutgers undergraduate chapter here at New Brunswick. So tonight we will be having a discussion to close the month of October, which is actually Filipinx-American Heritage or even History Month. So why are we doing this? We will be reading a little bit of our mission statement just to give like an idea of why we are having this cultural based event. So our goals are to empower Asian and Asian Pacific Islanders by developing cultural competencies in people of all backgrounds, ethnicities, and cultures in healthcare related fields, including medicine, dentistry, physician assistant, PT, nursing, research, etc. We want to promote a deeper understanding and sensitivity of Asian minority groups within the community, and also just to create lifelong connections for our members, which will transcend beyond Rutgers and the professional world.
We are becoming part of the National APAMSA organization, which is dedicated to addressing the unique health and societal challenges of APIA, Asian Pacific Islander American communities, through education, outreach, advocacy, and service. So tonight we've prepared a couple of questions that we wanted to address and speak about. As it might not be obvious, but Netanya and I are both Filipino, so this was a very cool event for us to host. This was actually the first year that I'd ever heard of Filipino American Heritage Month, but I think it's very reflective of where we are in society and all of the race politics that are ongoing around us. So in efforts to build cultural competency and discuss how it reflects in our lives and how it impacts our professional career, we've made some questions and we'll be answering them for you. So the first one we have is, what is Filipinx and how is it different from Filipino and Filipina? So Netanya, do you want to start?
So this is actually something new that I've learned recently last year about the difference between Filipinx and Filipina. So based on research, Filipinx is more of a westernized inclusion, and it's for LGBTQ gender neutral language. So what I found is that the letter X is not actually included in the Filipino alphabet, which has caused a lot of controversy, especially between Filipino Americans and Filipinos who live in the home country. So an example of some Filipino words that our roots of origin use is like siya or niya, which are gender neutral. So there's a lot of conversations about what's the need for having the letter X. Is it because we are trying to be more inclusive as Filipino Americans, or is it because we are kind of straying from who we are from our home country's culture?
Yeah, that's great. I just want to add on that Filipinx, I believe the first word that came was Latinx and Filipinx followed suit. So when we talk about X as opposed to O or A, O is typically masculine, A is feminine, and a lot of romantic languages are gendered. And I was trying to find some literature to base this on, but grammatical gender carries connotative meanings of femininity and masculinity. And so with the American language, we don't see this as much because it's a mismatch of a lot of different roots. But one really cool example that I found was the word bridge, which in Spanish is a masculine word and in German is a feminine word. In one study done by Lyra Borodsky in Stanford, she proposed that the word bridge in German, which is, I don't know how to say it, but it's feminine. It's like de Brück. And in bridge, it's El Puente. They asked native speakers how they would describe a bridge, just a picture of it, and what you would expect out of the connotation of the gender in the words. German speakers who use bridge in a feminine sense describe the bridge as beautiful, fragile, elegant, slender, pretty, while Spanish speakers saw it as a bridge was dangerous, long, sturdy, big, towering. So this connotation holds that in gender and grammar, we perceive things differently. And then I have in my notes that a cool thing that it's not exclusive to Filipinx. Like I said earlier, it's Latinx or Chicanx, which is Mexican specific. But it's definitely a growing movement, and language is growing and always binding by the rules. So this new word that we have, Filipinx, it's reflective of the progressive ideals in, like Netanya said, Western society. So some native Filipino speakers or Latinx or Latino or Chicano might not agree with it, but it's a very progressive ideal that kind of helps to encompass the gender non-binary or binary, or non-binary. And so it's a great discussion for us to kind of include the LGBTQ plus and how it reflects what we understand of gender today.
Definitely. And it begs the question of, should we also start changing how, for example, in the Filipino language, we use tita, tito to address our elders. So if we start using the letter X, where does the boundaries lie, and when should we start using it in certain occasions like that?
Yeah, that's really great. I didn't even think about tita or tito, like ticks. It's very strange, but
It would definitely just be like universal in a way, but then again, with the way Filipino culture tends to work, we do want to have like that some sort of like gender identity, because they still do work on like the gender binary. And I don't want to say it's less progressive, but it's definitely different from westernized culture.
definitely. I did want to include this one example. It was very controversial. In 2014, there was a transgender woman. So Jennifer Loud, she was in the Philippines and she was meeting up with a United States Marine Corps, Joseph Scott Pemberton. He was 19 years old and he was a lance corporal. And he admitted to assaulting Jennifer, and his defense was trans panic defense. So this crime was committed on Philippines land, and his charge was downgraded from murder to homicide, but it was later found that he admitted to murdering Jennifer after he found out she was transgender and had been born a male. So quite obviously that is murder, and he got away with it with kind of a slap on the wrist relatively to what could have happened, which is just very unfortunate. And these hate crimes are happening, and so we want to include these people's identities and be aware that there's still a lot of stigma against them, and be supportive where we can and accept that they are people and deserving of recognition, that even if we don't have the language to reflect them like 100 years ago, they still existed.
Definitely. And Jennifer Loud's story, I remember when the news first came out about that, I didn't fully understand what exactly the societal issues were behind that. And especially now with the movie Call Her Ganda, which is kind of like I believe it's like an indie film or like a documentary on her story and like her murder case timeline, but it definitely gives an insight into how they are perceived and how they're treated, especially like in today's world where you would expect things to be more progressive, but we're still dealing with a lot of other things.
Definitely. And another example I had was this paper by, let me see if I included who wrote it, but it's a paper that cited the work of a Tumblr post, and I thought that was really funny. But basically, it was a Tumblr post with some visual art, and the picture said, "I'd rather be beautiful than male." And in the analysis of this picture, they said that by using beautiful instead of female, this artist, Mark Aguilar, alludes to the limitation of the spectrum, how gender identity and expression can exist beyond masculine or feminine, defying the existence of the gender binary, male or female, itself.
I think that was a good start to the conversation, Sarah, about where the language comes from, kind of like where our identity comes from. Yeah. I think it also puts us into the next question of, as we identify as a Filipino American, how is it different from being purely Filipinx or an American one?
Okay, can you hear me? I switched the
Yes.
headset as you did. Okay. So since you started the other question, I'll go. So for this question, I didn't cite as many sources because I really wanted to reflect that my experience is my own and many people will relate, but everyone has their own unique subset of experiences, of course. So as a Filipinx-American, and I do like the term Filipinx, I have perspective from both sides. What I mean to say by this is I was born in America. I'm American citizen, and I have these two sets of ideals in my head that I was raised with. So in psychology, we'll reference collectivism versus individualism. Americans are individualist, while Filipinos are collectivist. They value the society as a whole rather than an independent person by itself. And having that perspective has allowed me to really be empathetic and kind of consider both parts, how it's important for me to be strong, stand on my own 2 feet, but also consider how my actions and thoughts and words can affect those around me. And as someone who was born in America, I think that I have an easier time than, let's say, a Filipino who moved to America later in life. I don't have an accent. I would consider I do have many privileges because I'm fairer skinned, and colorism is a topic that we'll be addressing later on, but it's afforded me opportunities that I wouldn't be expecting. And later on in life, I learned that even having white passing name like Sarah is such a benefit in life that as opposed to ethnic names. And that's things that I grew up not realizing, but hearing it later in life, studying it, reading about it, it's made such an impact in how I perceive the world around me, how we see these implicit injustices that are not easy to recognize, especially growing up if you don't know what to look for. So
Definitely.
yeah, with Filipino culture, it's very family based. With American culture, it's how to stand on your own 2 feet.
I agree with all the points that you said. I know for me, for my identity, I was also born here in the US. I am both a US citizen and a Filipino citizen. The way that worked is there was a time where my parents decided, God forbid something happened here in the US, we would be able to go home in the Philippines and I would, in a way, be welcomed through my citizenship. Even with that legal authorization, a piece of paper, whatever it may be, there is still that disconnect I have here in the United States and whenever I do go back home. I went home to the Philippines, I believe 2 summers ago, and although I do love going home there, it also brings back a sense of an identity crisis because again, I wasn't born there. I do have an accent when I do try to speak the native language, and you can't help but feel as though you're lacking in who you are and what you're doing there in that country. For instance, a story that I do recall is I was buying something from the grocery store, the Sari Sari store in our province, and I have a very I would say a very decent grasp on the language on our dialect. My family speaks Bisaya. But I remember I walked up to the lady and I tried speaking, and then she was so focused on the fact that, oh my gosh, you have an accent. And she was so focused on that it kind of reminded me I'm still a foreigner in a place where I'm supposed to feel welcomed. And that's okay because you know what? We're all we're all over the world and we all have our own experiences, different places where we come from. And people can't fully understand that. We don't even fully understand that ourselves. So it's definitely something I grapple with every day. Coming to Rutgers, it's just a huge blessing that, Sarah, I met you, for instance, another Filipino. There is a Filipino organization, actually many. There's RAPS, there's Rutgers Anak Bayan, there's Gabriella, New Jersey. So there's many organizations that I have somewhere to turn to for my culture. But at the same time, there is also a chance to be able to acknowledge the fact that I was born here as a Filipinx-American. So I think the balance is still being searched for. But at the end of the day, it's up to you if you want to actually search for that balance in the way that works for you.
Yeah, and you mentioned it, but you speak Visay and your family speaks Visay. I just want to mention for anyone who doesn't know that there are over 7,000 islands in the Philippines. The main language is Tagalog, which is the language that I'm familiar with. So it's really cool for me that Natanya knows Visayan. But yeah, I said earlier that I grew up in the US without an accent, but then going to the Philippines, I've only been there twice in my life. I have an accent, so it's kind of flipped. But as opposed to people looking down on me for my accent, it's almost the opposite. Because I have this American accent, people assume that, oh, you come from America, you must be rich. So if we go to markets and stuff, I try not to speak too much, or I keep it short because I'm not as fluent. So I let my family speak, and it's because the fact that the local vendors, they'll try and hike up prices because you're a foreigner to them and you have money relative to them, which is true and it's fair. And I understand it. Like, they're just trying to make a living. But yeah, I like that you mentioned that. Something else came to mind when you were speaking, and I can't remember what it was right now, but I found it. In my notes, I included what a traditional Filipino family is like, and I can mention it later, but in my notes, it's that present Filipino culture is an integrated mixture of Malaysian, Chinese, Indonesian, Asian Indian, Spanish, and American influences. And that's predominantly, of course, there can be other influences like Korean or Japanese, a lot of influence from colonialism, some with Portuguese and stuff. But yeah, it's very diverse. And like I said, we're sharing our experiences, but our experiences are not reflective of everyone, of all Filipino Americans. So we're telling you what we know from our lives, but we hope it kind of makes sense.
And as you mentioned before, the colonization, the Philippines, for those of you who don't know, we were colonized by the Spaniards, hence why our country is called the Philippines, because it was named after King Philip. I believe we were also colonized by the US at some point in time during World War, I believe too. Don't quote me on that.
So yeah, I can clarify.
Yeah.
After the Spaniards colonized the Philippines, there was the Spanish-American War. And in the Spanish-American War, Spaniards lost, and America ended up with Philippines as the first U.S. colony. So we weren't a commonwealth, we were a colony, an actual colony. And there was a lot of backlash against that, particularly with critical thinkers like Mark Twain, who were in support of these indigenous peoples, which was really cool to hear about in like a push for like the 5 minutes we went over it. But we became an independent country after World War II, when like the treaties were being made and everything. The Philippines did fight with the U.S. for the World War II and World War I, and as a result of their contributions in World War I, some Filipinos actually were able to become citizens and have voting power. And I forget the exact year, but definitely earlier than like 1920, because that's when women got the right to vote. But then all Americans didn't get the right to vote until the Walter McLaren Act of 1952.
Yeah, and I believe if you fought under the US, I know my great grandfather, he was actually named an American veteran. So I don't know how that process works, but a lot of Filipinos, even if they didn't end up living as an American citizen later on, they were able to get the benefits of veterans later on in life.
Yeah, it's really cool. Do you have anything else to add for this question, or do you want to go on to the third?
We can go on, yeah.
Okay. So our third question was, how is mental health perceived in Filipinx culture? Do you want me to start? Do you want to start?
You can start. This is a big one.
Yeah, so I'll start this out with what I know personally, what I've experienced. So in Tagalog, there are a couple of phrases I wanted to mention, and the first one is loco loco, and it basically means crazy, and people use it casually or literally So if someone's being wacky or silly or goofy, someone will say, oh, they're so loco. But there's another word that's sirang ulo. And if I'd had to translate it, it literally means broken head. And sirang ulo also means like a crazy person. So in the Filipino culture, as far as I know, like there's an awareness that there are mental disorders, but depending on how educated you are, it's not really seen as a big deal depending on how crazy someone's perceived to be, because there's kind of a carefree casual regard for it, and how people are just weird like that sometimes, like, you know, like maybe someone's second cousin's kind of strange, but you just deal with it and move on with your life. And there's kind of a stigma against mental health, and I think this is true of all cultures, that having mental health issues is kind of a vulnerability that people don't typically discuss openly. And I think that the Filipino culture is no exception. So, as far as actual academic literature, I tried to look up some sources upon this. And I found out that there was actually a mental health act in 2016 for the Philippines. And one journal of interprofessional education and practice published an article in 2019 to say baseline assessments on the quality of interprofessional collaboration among Filipino mental health professionals. So kind of loaded, but basically, how's mental health in these Filipino medical workers? So they found that ultimately there was average quality of mental health practice with those workers, which you could say that, okay, good, that's average. But then if you break it down further, it's saying that these mental health professionals who, in their own fields, aren't really accessing mental health care proactively or well. You would think that if this is their career, that they should be higher than average, right? And if that's where they are at as mental health professionals, then what does that say about the rest of the population or people who don't even have homes? You know, there's not accessibility. How many people can actually get to these resources? What few there are. So there is some progress being made, but with all the wealth disparity, it's just not enough.
I definitely agree with that, with everything you're saying. And it's really sad to think about, especially as our generation definitely opens up more about mental health awareness. There's always going to be that cultural stigma against talking about your feelings, talking about your emotions, talking about how to deal with those emotions. And I actually found something from the NIH for a research paper regarding mental health, actually for the Filipino-American community. And it said we are more likely to suffer from various factors of environmental and social issues than any other Asian counterpart group, which kind of brought up the question to me, especially when it came to faith and religion, for instance. I think the sad part is, although like we had this at our Active Minds meeting with collaboration, Christian Bandalo mentioned that the Catholic faith is definitely some sort of, I would say, a cane, which is completely fine and completely valid for those of us who want to hang on to who want to use faith as our coping mechanism. But I think to use that as a way to disregard someone's like overall mental health is degrading in a way and kind of takes away that power from them.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned religion. I think that is a big factor, and it's worth mentioning that 86% of the Filipino population is Roman Catholic, specifically, not just Christian. And that really reflects into the culture itself. So I found a book and I cited some passages out of it, but to condense it, the book is by Aurora Tompar and Juliana Susteno Senoriches, and they're both medical doctors. This book was published in 1995. It's called Depression and Other Mental Health Issues, the Filipino-American Experience. And basically, they had a whole chapter outlining what a traditional Filipino family was. And I just found it so fascinating because it really reflects my experience. And I guess I'm just a traditional Filipino family. But what they had to say was that the traditional setup is nuclear in that there's a husband/father, wife/mother, and children, but also bilateral extended family. which includes relatives of both the husband and wife, and that it's very common in Filipino culture to maintain close ties with your first, second, third cousins and their families. And as Netanya said, with religion, there's this kind of belief of bahala na, and it's an acceptance of one's fate, kind of passively. And they said that it's determination in the face of uncertainty. And they attribute this to the religion that Filipinos hold, that there's this come what may attitude, that even though things are going to be hard, you just let go and everything will work out in the end. Just let it be. And it's very reflective with religion and how that plays into the culture.
Definitely. I agree with that completely. They always say like let go and let God.
Yeah.
So do you have anything else more to add about that for mental health?
I kind of have something on colonial mentality, but I think it'd be better to mention it with colorism.
Okay. So our next question would be what is the perception of white ideology in Filipinx culture? And I actually wanted to open this up with a quote from a book I read. I highly recommend it, Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hung, who is a Korean poet. And she's actually a professor at Rutgers Newark. I believe she teaches the master's program for poetry. So definitely a great writer. So here we go. When I hear the phrase, Asians are next in line to be white, I replace the word white with disappear. Asians are next in line to disappear. We are reputed to be so accomplished and so law-abiding. We will disappear into this country's amnesiac fog. We will not be the power, but become absorbed by power. Not share the power of whites, but be stooges to a white ideology that exploited our ancestors. This country insists that our racial identity is beside the point. That has nothing to do with being bullied or passed over for a promotion or cut off every time we talk. Our race has nothing to do with this country even, which is why we're often listed as other in polls and why we're hard to find in racial breakdowns on reported rape or workplace discrimination or domestic abuse. It's like being ghosted, I suppose. We're deprived of all social cues. I have no relational gauge for my own behavior. I ransack my mind for what I could have done, could have said. I stop trusting what I see and what I hear. My ego is in free fall while my superego is boundless, railing that my existence is not enough, never enough. So I become compulsive in my efforts to do better, be better, blindly following this country's gospel of self-interest, proving my individual worth by expanding my net worth until I vanish. End quote.
Yeah, that was really powerful. And I just want to interrupt because I'm an interrupting person. No, because the language she used was very provocative, and I really appreciate that she said that we're disappearing. So she alludes to this whitewashing of culture, that in the uniformity that we strive to be, that we lose ourselves in the process. And then she also alludes to Freudian psychology, the id, the ego, the superego, which is really cool. Your intrinsic motivations, like aside from what you portray to others, as well as she says this cultural exchange is a gospel. So there's kind of this sense of divinity towards how we regard and how we strive to be this ideal. But yeah.
It's funny how you mentioned whitewashing. I actually saw an Instagram post about the term whitewashing in general, and it definitely raised questions about why are we choosing the word whitewash? Why not brown wash, Asian wash, or any other type of wash? And I remember the post said it was because there is still that mindset that whites are the superiority. And it's kind of sad because we don't even notice like when we say it, why we say it. It's become such a norm in our everyday vernacular that it's become the norm. And I really like how you brought that up because it definitely emphasizes how, although we are considered the model minority, which we'll get to later, it kind of unveils the idea that no, we're actually not. We are as forgotten as any other minority in this country. Although we are a little bit more, I guess, elevated in how we are seen by others, we still experience forms of racism and forms of exclusion.
Yeah. Did you have anything else to add to that before I go on?
No.
Colorism, like your experiences or anything?
I'll bounce off of what you say.
Okay. So with the perception of white ideology in Filipinx culture, like I said earlier, I'm pretty fair-skinned relative to the general population. I'm not brown, really. I would say I am because I don't look it. There's phenotypes. So, like I said, I haven't been disadvantaged by the color of my skin. And so in Asian cultures, and not just Filipino cultures, you see a lot of adverts for skin whitening products and products that make you lighter. And it's really weird to me, as an Asian American, as a Filipinx-American, because in the US, you'll see the opposite, people trying to get tanner. Like if you see before and after pictures of celebrities like Ariana Grande, where she's white, and then she's almost ambiguously colored, and the Kardashians, who are, I believe, Armenian, but then they like get tan, and people say that some days she's darker than her husband, Kanye West. So just like that, it's that these two opposing beauty ideologies at play. And for most of the world, it's a Eurocentric model of beauty that you want to be fair, you want to be white in some ways. And I think maybe some of that is part of the effects of World War II and kind of that ideal person with blonde hair, blue eyes. And I think that because it was such tragedy, that it's still kind of an ideal that's reinforced even today.
Definitely. And coming from the perspective of someone who's like darker in comparison to like the lighter skinned Asians, I would say my experience hasn't been as bad as like I've heard of others. And I'm really grateful for that because it can be mentally and emotionally draining. But I do remember growing up, I would be, I believe, the only one out of all my cousins that was darker. And you would see in the pictures that I would blend in a little bit to the background because, especially in the summer, my skin will get a little bit darker than usual. And it never really bothered me unless someone said something about it. Even then, I was happy with my skin. I was proud of it because what I saw on TV was whenever I saw someone who was moreno, which means dark skinned, I would say, that looks like me. That's someone I can look up to. And it never occurred to me that, especially in Filipino media, they would be promoting glutathione. They'd be promoting papaya products to whiten underarms or whiten skin. And I think it's really sad that we are still at that point where we're trying to justify how we look, even though we shouldn't. And it's definitely something that has to have more conversations, even if it is uncomfortable, just like anything else.
Yeah. And going back off of what you said, when you're young, you don't really notice all these microaggressions happening against you, these implicit biases from your titas, your titos, your cousins, your aunts and uncles. That's tito and tita, in case that wasn't clear. But like I would get compliments when I was younger that, wow, you're so white. And in Tagalog, that'd be like, ang puti mo, like, oh, you have white skin, puti is white. And I remember, I think this was 3 years ago at my second trip to the Philippines. I went to the beach with some cousins there, and a lot of emphasis on like skincare, putting on sunscreen. And they're like, yeah, put a lot of sunscreen, you might get burnt, you're puti. And then at the end of the beach day, I was kind of surprised that they said, yep, ang puti mo pa rin. Basically, you're still white. And like they meant that as a compliment. And I understood the sentiment, like, oh, you're still nice looking. But like, why are you rewarding me for something that I can't control? Like, how dare I produce less melanin than someone else? Like, that's not a standard of beauty. That's just like nature and nurture. Like, that's my genetics. That's the sun's rays, the UV rays. Like, penetrating my skin. Like melanin is a protective skin covering. It helps protect you. Like it's something that helps you in life. Why do you hate yourself for your body being a defense mechanism?
Mhm.
And I really, really hate compliments where like, oh, you're so white. Like, no, compliment me on something that matters. Tell me something about the quality of my character, not how this physical appearance that I cannot control is what makes me beautiful.
And it's upsetting because in a way it's kind of pitting light-skinned people against darker-skinned people where there's no reason to put some sort of boundaries. And yeah.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention it earlier, but again, with like colonial mentality, that with colonialism, if you are fairer skinned, that usually implies you have more money, especially in the Philippines. Back in the day, it's not so true anymore, but with generations of oppression, like if you do have lighter skin, like there is some imperialism in there somewhere. So one of the quotes I have from the mental health book I mentioned earlier was that Filipinos were oppressed and exploited for 4 centuries by their colonizers. So they learned to think of themselves as inferior to other colonizers and value Western looks, goods, and culture as superior to their consciousness and cultural identity. Filipino immigrants bring with them this colonial mentality, which can impede their upward socioeconomic mobility and political assertiveness in their new country. So there's this kind of innate sense that you are lesser than because of how you look. And that's not something that we want to promote. But also, it is promoted. Natanya mentioned media and like the adverts. And in a lot of the Filipino dramas that are played on TV here, like on the cable box, like GMA, and I forget the other channel. But there's like two.
CBN.
Yeah, those two Filipino channels that a lot of Filipino households have. Like a lot of the dramas, there's a lot of half Filipinos, which isn't bad, like cultural mixing. But I've noticed that majority of the actors are fair skinned, and I'd consider myself pretty fair skinned, but they're if not as fair skinned as I am, then more fair skinned. And my mom, like, I don't know how she knows. I guess she just Googles them, but she'll say, "Oh, that person's like half Irish. That person's half
Oh my gosh,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, like half, like whatever, just random things." And like have anything that makes them look not Filipino, like have anything that makes them look white. And that's not a bad thing that they look like that. But why is that the representation of all these soap operas, of all these dramas, when that's not what the majority of people look like? Why is there 90% of these actors light skinned when the opposite is reflective of the Filipino population? Most of them are darker skinned. And that's why a lot of comparisons are made between the skin color of like Mexicans and Filipinos, because like in skin phenotype, it's similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of glorification, especially like for the the halfies, my mom likes to say. It's really funny you mentioned like the actresses too, because I always think about this. I don't recall seeing a 100% pure Filipina being represented on Miss Universe. I I may be wrong about this, but Catriona Gray is half, Pia Wurtzbach was half German. Um, yeah, so I don't there's nothing wrong with like them representing at all. They're amazing people. They're great role models with their own nonprofits and charities. But it does make me question, why have we not yet had a pure 100% Filipina that represents the face of the majority of Filipinos?
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, there's nothing wrong with being light skinned. There's nothing wrong with being a symbol for other light skinned people. But why is the minority reflecting the majority when most of the nation is dark skinned? Why do we only see this small fraction being represented? Why can't these little kids growing up in the Philippines see people who look like them in these national broadcasts and beauty pageants? But yeah, that's not exclusive to the Filipino culture. Like that's very common in Asian
Mm-hmm.
culture in general.
So I think we can move on to the next question if you would like to go for that.
Yeah. So one distinction we would like to make is that May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, which as of 2009 was renamed to Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, while October is Filipino American Heritage / History Month. So why does Filipino culture get its own month in the US and it's October, whereas everyone else is grouped together in May? And I can tell you that I don't know for sure, but I would have to say it has to do with all the advocates of Filipino Americans and their efforts in the US. From what I understand, the Filipino American Heritage History Month organization, they had been advocating for this for a while. And it started out in either Hawaii or California, where there is a large population of Filipinos, where they wanted to celebrate their history. And like we said, there were Filipinos here like prior to World War One, because the U.S. colonized the Philippines so long ago that there were people here even in like the 1800s, right? And that there was kind of this historical gap that wasn't showing their efforts and everything here, and like settling and making colonies. But yeah, so the Filipinos are actually the second most populous Asian demographic in the US. First is Chinese, second is Filipino, third is Indian. So growing up, I didn't know a lot of Filipinos. I would consider myself to have lived in a diverse area. But now that I'm older, I still consider it diverse, but there's kind of like pockets of culture. Like Parsippany is very Indian. The area I'm around, Dover, is very Hispanic. So these towns are very, very distinct in culture. But while there's a lot of culture around me, it's not really a mixing. It's not like a melting pot. It's more of a mixed salad. And I forget where that's attributed from, but I think it's very reflective and very true of what I would have once considered super diverse. Like there's a lack of integration in that regard, which is interesting, but it's a lot of factors. I would say part of it, like if you look at urban areas um, like Chicago and like redlining and white flight, like there's a lot of things go into why that happens. But because there are a lot of Filipinos in the US, I guess it's just the efforts of the Filipinos who have been here, who have been able to make a Heritage Month, History Month. And I'd say thank you for your efforts. And also, when are the months for like the Chinese Americans, the Indian Americans, the Taiwanese Americans, the um, Korean Americans, Viet Americans? Like, there's so many flavors of Asian, and they're all grouped together in May. That's understandable. So I guess Filipinos are lucky to have this month. But like I said, I'd never heard of it before this year. So kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. And actually, the theme, I just found this today for this History Month for Filipino American History Month is actually activism. And especially with today's social climate, there's a lot of things going on, and it just highlights how we as Filipinos in the United States play a very imperative role in getting involved around our communities. Some social justice movements that they actually listed that make this month so important, especially this year 2020 for activism, is the United Farm Workers Movement, the Fight for Ethnic Studies, anti-martial law movements, and much more. They even include Black Lives Matter, American Indian Movement, civil rights and voting rights, women's rights, LGBTQ, and the list goes on and on. And I think definitely that theme is very, very relevant to what's going on today's culture and will be relevant until the end of time. Definitely important.
Yeah. While you're talking, I looked it up, and Filipino American History Month became an official month in 2009, but it was first recognized by Hawaii in 2008. But it had been celebrated previously in like 1991 by the Filipino American National Historical Society. So they were the ones, their board of trustees were the ones who first proposed this month. But yeah. When you were talking about just now, I lost my train of thought. But can you repeat it, like just briefly?
Which part of it?
Like the ending. There's something that I wanted to say.
Our involvement with the Black Lives Matter movement, Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, women's rights, LGBTQ.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, but with with the state of things as they are now, we're in a pandemic, and the election is coming up in about 2 weeks. As of now, it is Friday, October 23rd, 2020, and Netanya and I are serving our executive board positions on APAMSA for the 2020 to 2021 school year. But I would say we're experiencing a lot of history. There's a lot of unrest, a lot of tumultuous things going on. And there's always history going on because history is always happening. But I'd say it's very socially charged. And with Black Lives Matter, I would say they're losing momentum now that things are moving forward. And I do want to just bring attention to, we're promoting cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, that there is this phenomenal little TikTok I saw where Black culture is the only cultural that's grouped by their skin, as opposed to like a national culture, which is like ethnic culture, like Filipino, or like regional, like Southern American. And so Black culture is unified by an experience, because Black American culture has been erased in a lot of ways. So when we think about slavery and the slave trade, how a lot of people were brought here and they don't know where they're from now. Descendants, like if they're Black, maybe they could have been from any country in Africa. Africa is a continent, and there are so many African countries. So there's this erasure. And to know that we are Filipino, Natanya and I, that is a privilege in itself, that we can kind of trace our roots back to know that. So a lot of Black Americans, like, what are you? You don't know. And a lot of the censuses conducted in early American history kind of grouped Black Americans with people who are just dark skinned. So you could be anything. You could be Native Indian Black, or you could be like Asian Indian Black, or Caribbean Black. And you just have no clue, which is why we see Black culture as a legitimate culture, whereas white culture is not.
That's very true, yeah.
But yeah. So I kind of got off topic, but it's worth mentioning Black Lives Matter. Whatever you feel about it, just know that it's ongoing. Know that it's fighting for equity and equality, and that maybe you disagree with some aspects of it, but it's happening, and I hope it brings some good changes.
Don't forget to vote, guys, please. It's very important. Your voices are needed right now.
Yeah.
So if we are ready to wrap up that part,
Yeah.
if it's okay to move
Yeah.
on.
Yeah,
Okay.
go for it.
So affirmative action. So this is the question we're really curious about, especially as we are a pre-professional organization. So our own opinions, do we think it's okay for colleges and graduate programs to give preferential treatment to some candidates in the interest of diversity? Why or why not?
Would you like to start, or do you want me to start?
I can just say, for now, I think diversity is very, very important. There are some studies that if you go to a school with like high degree of diversity, you tend to excel more in your academic career. Rutgers is a very diverse university, and I'm very grateful for that. I've met many people that come from many backgrounds, and it's definitely something I don't take for granted, especially when it comes to networking and understanding like their identities and my identities. In terms of graduate programs, it's a very touchy subject because, you know, we do want to include as many people as possible to be able to be in the workforce and stuff like that. I think my only concern for myself that I think about is I don't like the idea of reaching a quota. I don't like the idea of putting a number on individuals based on their ethnicity or their race. And I think that's where a line has to be drawn, where are we including people for diversity for the sake of we want them as a person and we want them because we think they would be a great asset to this institution? Or are we just using them to fulfill a quota?
Yeah. So at Rutgers, New Brunswick specifically, according to College Factual, 40% of the undergraduate population is white, and second behind that is Asian at 25.7%, and then Hispanic Latino at 13.1%, and non-resident alien at 8.3%. And then it says Black or African American, and then ethnicity unknown. So I don't know what the number of Black or African American undergraduate population is in this chart. But yeah, that's to say that we're diverse compared to other institutions, but like, you know, I don't know how reflective of the whole American population our demographics are, but with affirmative action, it's a step to try to make things more fair for higher education. I don't think it's perfect, and I don't know that it always helps the people who need it most, because there are always going to be socioeconomic barriers, cultural capital that gets in the way of higher education. And so I think affirmative action as it is now, it tries to be progressive. I'm not sure how effective it is, but the point is that it is helping people who need it, just not all the people who need it. So there was this article that I found because I was trying to read up on affirmative action and like race politics. It's very messy, it's very sensitive, and I want to get it right. But, you know, it's not an exact science. It's a lot of opinions, and we do need some empirical evidence that is helpful. But basically, the article I found, it's called Racial Politics, Resentment, and Affirmative Action, Asian Americans as Model College Applicants. And this study suggests many of those who blame affirmative action policy for alleged discrimination against Asian American applicants are using racial politics to set different groups of people of color at odds with each other, and that blaming affirmative action fosters a divisive politics of resentment that then serves to deflect attention from the ultimate goal of dismantling affirmative action to safeguard elite college and university spots for white students. So affirmative action helps people. Does it help everyone? No, of course not. It's not perfect. But in the sake of helping those who need it, I think it does succeed in some aspect. And with being divisive, one is racial politics not divisive. So it does what it can. Could it be improved upon? Sure. Do I know enough to say how? No. I'd like to, but it would take more research. And I'd want to say that affirmative action like helps people, but if it's the quality of applicants pitted against each other, alone with like maybe a slight tinge of skin color, like if one applicant is more worthy than another, then what can we say? Because judging students on that alone, like what is worthiness to begin with, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about higher education and what it takes to get there, like socioeconomic barriers, like if you're smart, great, but think about tutoring, like MCAT tutors or not MCAT, SAT, ACT tutors, or testing books for those, private tutoring. So a lot goes into it, and especially also sports too, like people who join sports clubs when they're little, like you can afford to do sports clubs, you can afford sports equipment, you can afford maybe club training, lessons. So also that also helps build your profile as a student when you're applying to higher education. And if you come from somewhere of lower socioeconomic background, you don't have access to those kinds of resources.
I definitely agree. Couldn't have said it better myself. While you were talking, I actually found a court case that listed like the pros and cons for affirmative action. In a nutshell, the pros would be, like you said, Sarah, that it helps disadvantaged people who come from different areas that don't have as many opportunities, such as tutoring or like sports or networking that could lead them to higher levels of education. it's a way to compensate for the fact that due to many years of oppression, some races, quote unquote, started late in the race. Again, it would act as like a level for the playing field. Arguments that are against affirmative action would be, this document says that it's reverse discrimination in a way. So it argues that all people are equal under the laws of the United States and should be treated accordingly. And it also destroys the idea of meritocracy and instead puts race as a dominant factor in admissions and hiring procedures. Like you said, the best people for the position should be put there regardless of the color of their skin. And the list goes on, but like Sarah said, it's not a perfect system. It doesn't try to be, it's there to give opportunities to people.
Yeah, and when talking about things like affirmative action, I don't know if we drop these words throughout our discussion, but some key words that I would like to say and emphasize are diversity. So having a diverse population, people from different backgrounds to lend perspective, lend thoughts and ideas that you might not be aware of. And then another word, equity, kind of making everything fair, making everything just. So equity as opposed to equality. Equality is trying to get everyone to the same place, but equity kind of balances it out more fairly. So equality, it's like maybe someone has a stab wound, someone has a paper cut, and equality would be giving them a band-aid each. Equity would be like treating those separate wounds fairly. Like obviously someone with a stab wound needs more than a band-aid, whereas a paper cut for someone else would be like an acceptable form of treatment would be a band-aid. So yeah, equity is kind of addressing the situations uniquely as they should be addressed. And I don't know if I said it already, but inclusion. So sure, we have diversity, but then if there are a lot of different people around you, are they being included? It's kind of an in-group versus out-group bias. Even though someone doesn't look like you or someone's has some sort of difference from you in a way, can you empathize with them? Can you sympathize with them? Can you see yourself in their shoes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot plays a role into that.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything?
I think you touched upon a lot and everything. Well, really good job.
Thank you.
So, yeah, we do have one last question if you'd like to close this discussion.
I would like you to start it because I'm trying to find this really good post on my phone. So I want to look for it to see if I can find it while you're talking.
So our last question for tonight's discussion is, how does the model minority myth affect Filipinx people? So for those of you who don't know what the model minority myth is, it's the idea that Asians are the epitome of, I guess, how's the way to word it? We're the epitome of academics, success, we're all around just great, but that's not true. And to say that would be disregarding the stories of those who aren't fitting into that category. And where did this all start? So I learned this in my history class a long time ago out of interest, not from my direct history class, but there was a time when visas were being granted in the United States in certain Asian countries, but they were only granting those visas to those who were of high professionals, so doctors, engineers, mechanics. So when these Asians came here to the United States, they were already these professions. So it kind of gave people the idea that, oh, anyone can live the American dream, anyone can be successful because look at these minority groups. And I think that's very, very damaging because it puts pressure on us for those who weren't automatically in that position. And it also begs the question of, how do we stop this if we ourselves, sometimes as Asian Americans, we feed into this. We feed into the fact that, oh, we're put on the same level playing field of like white people, or we're put on the same level playing field for those who are considered successful, what happens to our counterparts that aren't as successful and don't fit into the model minority?
Yeah, well said. So model minority myth. I couldn't find the article I wanted to find, but we're also gonna do an IG live on Sunday night, so maybe I'll find it by then. But the model minority myth puts people at a disadvantage in both sides of the spectrum. So, like for example, the stereotype that all Asians are good at math, like that's not true. It's a stereotype, but it kind of makes it seem that there's this better than. So, as a model minority, the Asian population is seen as kind of more valuable than another minority group. And it kind of puts a wedge between these different marginalized identities. So it's harmful because it makes it seem as all of these Asians are coming from a place of privilege, which is inherently untrue. And then the people who don't fit into this model minority myth are disadvantaged because, like, oh, if all Asians are good at math, like you should have this kind of background and for this kind of work, and then the standards are raised against you in a way that kind of backfires. So with this idea that Asians are a model minority, it's kind of that the sentiment that, oh, Asian Americans are super prosperous, well educated, and successful. And that can be true of any cultural identity. Like there's success and disparity in any identity, but actually Asian Americans in the US have the highest, I believe, wealth disparity of all minorities. So they have rich people, but they have poor people, and the range between that is larger than in any other minority group. So what's that say about the model minority myth? Well, it says that it's untrue. But with Filipinos specifically, there's kind of this joke that the main export of the Philippines is nurses, and it's kind of true. Nurses, male and female, because of the way that colonialism and the U.S. hit the Philippines. There was this prompting, especially with World War II, to get nurses trained in the Philippines and have them come to the U.S. and nurse for cheap, so underpaid labor. And because these people are looking for work, trying to support their families, and the currency of money and American dollars was worth more than the Philippine pesos, they would work for little money in the U.S. and send it back to the Philippines. So nursing schools in the Philippines today are still pretty well regarded internationally, and nurses practice, Filipino nurses practice, Filipinx nurses practice, like in a lot of different countries. So, like, even though Filipino Americans are educated in that regard, that not every Filipino is a nurse or an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor. And especially for people who come here for the first time and are starting out, they're not benefiting from this. So this stereotype kind of casts a shadow over everyone else. But also like Asians in general, not just Filipinos.
Mm-hmm. And it truly does discount like the hard work, the tight-knit families that people may have, and just the success of individuals, because it's just like, am I only successful because of my status in society? Am I only successful because of the type of job I have? And I think we also should understand that success is measured by what you see, by what makes you happy. And if you're happy as working in the service industry, or if you're happy working as a healthcare professional, you're successful in your own right. And that's just another way that the model minority kind of affects people, in the fact that there shouldn't be subsets of how people should be considered the model.
Yeah. And I just wanted to quote from this article by NPR, National Public Radio. It's by Kat Chow, Model Minority Myth, again, used as a racial wedge between Asians and Black. And basically, they use some quotes from a professor at UC Irvine, Claire Jean Kim. And she said that racism that Asian Americans have experienced is not what Black people have experienced, and that Asians have faced various forms of discrimination, but never the systematic dehumanization that Black people have faced during slavery and continue to face today. This article goes on to say Asians have been barred from entering the US and gaining citizenship and have been sent to incarceration camps like the Japanese Americans during World War II. But all that is different than the segregation, police brutality, and discrimination that African Americans have endured. And that's very true that with model minorities and driving that wedge between us, it's kind of this sense that this competition on suffering. Why are we pitting our sufferings against each other? Why can't we uplift each other and address the system as a whole? So with like Black Americans, there's this Black, not just Black Americans, like also Hispanic Americans, Hispanics, and like Latinx, these groups that are racially targeted and dehumanized and criminalized. There's this school to prison pipeline that disadvantages them, that if they're in a hard community and their schooling systems aren't great, their zero tolerance policies have extreme punitive measures that send them to jail as minors. And then if you're a felon, even worse, especially with like drug charges, if you're a felon, you get disenfranchisement. You lose your right to vote, you lose your right to social welfare programs. It's harder to find a job. And so if you're poor and you're a criminal and a felon and you're trying to make it right in the world and pay off your debts and stuff, there's not an easy way to do that. And it's kind of this cycle of oppression that's occurring institutionally, that this mass incarceration isn't doing anything to reflect debt or improve the society, and it's more of a drain than anything. So why are we doing this to our fellow people? But yeah.
And to fix broken systems, we have to fix the systems within us, within our own circles of life. And yeah, it's really unfortunate, especially with like everything that's going on today. There's a lot of division where there doesn't need to be. There's a lot of hurt that needs to be addressed and paid attention to.
Definitely. And I'll find it for Sunday, but there's a comic I'll want to show you. So I'm just going to mention it so I remember. But with Black Lives Matter and this cultural sensitivity and all the politics with the presidential election coming up, there's this sense of fear to discuss politics. It's socially polarizing, wherein if you get two people with opposing ideals, they'll clash and go to further extremes in their perceptions of politics. So it's important to be able to have these sensitive conversations, to take it a step back and have an open mind and say when things are not okay, and to draw a line at what is acceptable and what trespasses that boundary. So getting political, right? It's kind of this connotation that you don't want to get involved in it, it's messy, that it can backlash against you. And it shouldn't. We should be able to have these open discussions. And obviously, things you say have consequences, and you always want to be careful of what you say and who you say it to. But if we can't even have discussions about equity and fairness and like the lawfulness of things, then it's kind of like you lose your right to freedom of expression. And like the distinction I'd like to make is that there's a difference between saying what you want freely and saying what you want freely, which is a hate crime, which infringes upon someone else's rights, which is a crime in and of itself. So yeah, I'm glad we could have had this discussion, and I do hope that in some way it does promote cultural competency and teach you something new or something you can relate to, regardless of whether you're Filipino or not. It's a lot of experiences that can be shared no matter what your cultural, ethnic, racial, religious, sexual identity is, etc., etc.
So that was the end of our questions. We really appreciate all of you that will watch this. Like we said in the beginning, we decided to have this discussion because we wanted to share our own identity stories and to kind of hear what your stories are all like and how everything in our lives, especially in today's world, plays a role in our presence and in our futures. So we really invite you guys to keep having these open discussions, keep having these hard conversations because they are very much needed. Keep questioning, keep trying to find out new things, and at the same time, also be mindful of what you are discussing. So make sure it's not hurting other people. Make sure it's not damaging someone's reputation, because at the end of the day, we are trying to fix whatever broken systems are visible in our world today.
Yeah. And right now, at the time of this discussion, right now, it's 9:24, 10:23 on 2020. So maybe this will be relevant again. Probably it will. Definitely it will. But we're going to post it to our social media. And if you guys have any questions for us or comments, please let us know. You can reach out to us directly. Email us at ruapamsa. Like I said, we're going to do an IG live on Sunday night. So if you want to talk to us, then that's completely fine. We'll have some activities planned. We don't expect too many people because of exams and everything.
Mhm.
But for those of you who do want to get involved and do want to have these conversations with us, we welcome you. And thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staring at us. And,
Thank you so much for taking the time out to listen to the whole thing if you were able to. We really appreciate you guys.